directed my remarks to the students in terms of raising their expectation levels about their significance in life over the next 15 or 20,000 days before they retire. And it will go very fast. You have about 15,000 days and a little over 2,000 weeks before you turn 65. And if you don't think that goes quickly, ask your parents and grandparents. Excuse me. I thought it would be good to start with a personal explanation of why I did what I did. It was really quite ordinary, except it was infrequent. It reflected a pattern in American history where a small number of people having knowledge of injustice that a large number of people knew about in the workplace, the marketplace, the environment, the government, but they decided to do something about it. And in doing something about it, they turned themselves from ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And in the history that you study, you can see that, how hard they tried over the years through the anti-slavery movement, the women's rights movement, the late 19th century drive for labor standards, for farmer rights against the big railroads and the big banks. These were all efforts started by a remarkably small number of people. But they had what Abraham Lincoln once said, the public sentiment behind it. And with the public sentiment, he thought you could do anything. And indeed, many of them coalesced in small parties, which never won a national election, but they prodded the major parties into adopting the changes that we all now take for granted. We take for granted that the laws abolish child labor. We take for granted that we have a retirement system, Social Security. We take for granted a 40-hour week. We take for granted progressive tax system. We take for granted a whole slew of labor standards. And of course, we have long ago integrated the results of the great 19th century movements dealing with regulatory law and order for big business and their mistreatment of workers and farmers and consumers, as well as the increasing cascade of civic rights and civic liberties, which started with the great abolition movement and leaders like Frederick Douglass, who once said, power concedes nothing without a demand. That's a very, very contemporary mantra to utilize. Power concedes nothing without a demand. Well, I started as a young person, 13, 14 years old, reading the old muckraking books, Ida Tarbell, The Great Expose of Standard Oil, The 1,000 Americans, The Concentration of Power in the Hands of the Few by George Seldes, 50 Leading Families of Wealth by another muckraking author. And I was just gripped by them. I was a big baseball fan, and I would listen to the Yankees on WINS with my ears, and I would read these books with my eyes. And they were very dramatic in my mind because they took the ethical precepts, whatever religious precepts we grew up with, and really applied them into practice to better human lives and advance the human possibilities of individuals here and elsewhere. I came across rarely quoted statements by Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt about corporate abuses. They weren't very much quoted in our history books, but they were very, very pointed. Lincoln thought that they represented a major threat to our democracy. They came of age and just before and during the Civil War, the railroads, for example, but he was very upset the way they sold the government during the Civil War, poisonous food, contaminated food, defective rifles, which led to many casualties. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, you know the history of how he believed that a certain part of the public lands have to be reserved for the public parks, national parks, and national forests. It was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a patrician if you ever saw one, who made the most severe remark about the corporate power. When in a message to Congress in 1938, he stated, requesting a commission to investigate concentrated corporate power, he said, quote, "Whenever government is controlled by private economic power, that is fascism." This was, of course, before Hitler, and Mussolini gave a even different meaning to that word. But it's corporate control of government leading to the corporate state, where government is turned against its own people or transfers tax money to corporations and other benefits that we've seen in the corporate bailout after the Wall Street crash. What was interesting about my reading is that I began to experience something that was pretty terrifying to me. And I lost a lot of friends to horrific accidents in the highway. And if they didn't die, they were disabled for life. In those days, it was much more frequent. The likelihood of you losing a friend in an auto crash today is 1/5 of what it was in the 1940s and 1950s. The death rate for automobiles has gone down dramatically per 100 million vehicle miles. But it was a very common occurrence in those days. And it never occurred to me to think that there was anything but the driver to blame. In fact, whenever the crash was announced, the question was the driver drinking? Was the driver sleeping at the wheel? We never incorporated the role of the vehicle and the role of the highway design itself. The role of the vehicle to have better brakes, better handling, better crash protection. The role of the highway to minimize the interaction of vehicles and collisions because of divided highways and other improvements that we now take for granted. But it wasn't until I hitchhiked a lot all over the country that the truck drivers that picked me up would come to the scene of the crash often before the emergency vehicles and the police. And the scene was out of a grisly war situation. I mean, screams, fires, severed limbs, the last wail of the dying. And I never forgot that. And when I got to law school, I did a third-year paper on unsafe automobile design and the lack of mandatory safety standards. And I turned that into a book called Unsafe in Speed a few years later, which is a good lesson, I think, for all students to learn, that they can take their academic work and turn it into something quite significant after they graduate. Well, after that, the question was I going to be a Lone Ranger, write a book exposing one industry after another, or was I going to be more sensible and try to build as many groups as I could in one area after another: consumer, environmental, worker safety, freedom of information, student testing, etc. And I decided I would do the latter. And I was very fortunate because in those days the students were really alive. These were the students who fought to get us out of the Vietnam quagmire, the students who put their bodies on the line in the civil rights movements, heavily in the South. Many of them were beaten up or taken to jail or worse. These were the students who lit up the country on Earth Day in April 1970. There were 1,500 events at 1,500 universities and colleges, put the issue of environmental violence, to charitably called pollution, on the political and media map. And so out of that kind of ferment, we are able to start student public interest research groups. You may have heard of Colorado PIRD, but there are about 20 of these groups that the students fund and the students run through their elected board of directors, where they hire older people, maybe in their 20s, late 20s and 30s, lawyers, scientists, organizers, analysts, demonstrators, lobbyists, to improve their state. And those groups still exist. And some of them are the most powerful citizen groups in the state, in New York, Massachusetts. They're not one-issue groups. They deal with a whole panoply of injustices, including prison reform. They've even gone into the deception of multiple choice standardized tests that purport to put a number on a specious concept that they call intelligence, etc. And when we did that, we asked ourselves, what percent of students did all this? All these student movements. It was never more than 5% real active students. But they represented the sentiments, the sense of right and wrong, the sense of fair play of many more students. And in so doing, that's a good lesson to learn. Don't think you ever have to get a majority of people to roll up their sleeves and break their routines and get involved in citizen action. You don't have to do that. You have to make sure that the material you advance is accurate, that it touches on a perceived injustice or one that could be understood, and that reflects the sense of right and wrong, justice and injustice of a larger number of people from whose energies, however passive, you draw on to make the breakthroughs and the changes. Now today's students, you have 16 million college graduate and community college students. And what you should be doing is be standing on the shoulders of your forebears in the 60s, 70s, and actually have a greater impact than they did. And they even helped change the curriculum. I remember at law school, when I was at law school, we didn't have courses on the environment, we didn't have law courses on corporate crime, we didn't have law courses on consumer protection or women's rights. And we had courses that trained the young lawyers to get jobs in big corporate law firms. So we had a lot of commercial law courses. The students changed that. There are now 30 clinical programs, everything from immigration to child abuse at Harvard now. And all these courses that I didn't have are now a part of the curriculum. And it was the students who motivated and jarred the faculty, they had a few allies, as is the case, into changing the curriculum as well. And your curriculum is much broader than it was 50 or 60 years ago. So the question is, why didn't your generation of students, with the obvious exceptions, stand on the shoulders and build on the students as active citizens? The students who define engagement not just as charity, but as justice. You know the difference. Charity is helping out at soup kitchens. Justice is asking why a rich country has to have 13 million children go to bed hungry at night when we have plenty of food and we have plenty of aspirations for a good society. The students in the 60s, they were more and more going away from the palliative into trying to get at the roots of racial bigotry, gender bigotry, getting to roots of the war machine abroad, getting at the roots of the technologies that made it profitable to pollute instead of the technologies that would make it profitable not to pollute. And you can see the emergence of the Occupy movement here, which is drawing on students and may well become a historic turning point. Obviously, the verdict is not in. The Occupy movement started with just a handful of people in New York and Zuccotti Park. They called themselves Occupy Wall Street. A good many of the leaders actually came from the Bay Area, from Oakland and Berkeley, but they amplified their ranks. And they did a number of things very brilliantly. The 99% model will go down as really a brilliant model, because what that did was focus heavily on the concentration of power and wealth in the top 1% and their influence over government. That includes corporations, of course, not just personally wealthy people. But by doing that, they didn't split themselves in identity politics. They didn't come forward as clusters of people championing African American rights, gay lesbian rights, environmental rights, worker rights, because they knew that that would start splitting and they would be jockeying for priority and for attention. So number one, they moved out in an extremely unified manner. The second is, when they were blocked, they innovated. So when they were prevented from using bullhorns, they developed mic check. And the mic check was a stroke of genius, because it kept the speeches relatively brief, and it rolled out into the further audience in a participatory manner. They also began learning the skills of nonviolent civil disobedience, open nonviolent civil disobedience. That takes a lot of self-discipline, especially when you're being roughed up by the police. It takes a lot of repressing the instant impulse to fight back for the longer range triumph of the tactic of nonviolent civil disobedience. They gave a new meaning to public space. Instead of just looking at part, they utilized public space. They stayed 24 hours, which of course impressed the media, because media is used to 3-hour marches. They're not used to 24-hour, around the clock, where there's a medic table, there's a library, there's a legal aid table, and basically a sub-society growing up in the middle of these cities. And they went out to about over 100 locales. I know you had one here, 4 tents. In your community, which spawned the free speech issue. And because they were decentralized, they didn't want leaders. They didn't want leaders to be discredited or slandered and then discrediting the whole effort. So they tried to stay leaderless, although people specialized. Some of them were organizers, some of them were cooks, some of them guarded the area, and so forth. And another thing they did, they so impressed the press that the architectural editor for the Washington Post had an aerial view of McPherson Square in downtown Washington, D.C., and the way they named the different paths and the creative way they organized. And it wasn't without torment, and they attracted a lot of homeless people and desperate people that they weren't ready to take care of. And the architectural editor called it an example of vibrant urbanism. And this is a rather restrained architectural editor. So obviously, there was a penumbral effect beyond the encampments. You had Governor Cuomo, who resisted extending the tax increase on the wealthy in New York, which is pretty modest. He was going to let it expire. And because of the whole aura that was created, he decided to change his mind. There are a lot of people now who are taking courage from the small number of people from a variety of ages in the background who made up the Occupy movement. And I estimated that no more than 200,000 people have pulled off the first stage of the Occupy movement. Just 200,000 people, including the marchers, not just the encampers. That ought to tell you that we better start reevaluating our induced sense of powerlessness and our rough estimate that it takes far more to change things than is actually the case. As long as you have public sentiment behind you, it takes far, far less. It's important then to raise our expectation levels. You'll forgive me if I comment that I think your generation has extraordinarily low and dangerous expectation levels. Dangerous because you are not upset about declining standards of living to the degree that you wish would be the case. You think you're going to be the exception. You think you're going to escape the general trend downward since 1973 of real wages adjusted for inflation, the trend downward in real household income, the trend downward in the number of people employed compared to those who want to be employed. 25 million people who are underemployed or unemployed or stopped looking for work. That's a staggering figure. There's a vast escalation of consumer debt. There's a sense that even white-collar and blue-collar jobs can be exported to countries that repress their workers, sometimes paying them 70 cents an hour, throw them in jail if they start to form a union, the kind of workers who build the iPad and the iPhones that you hold so dearly day after day. 450,000 workers in one plant in China build Apple's iPads and other gadgets, and they have an enormous turnover, and it's almost like an industrial gulag. They even have nets to anticipate suicides. There are 13 people in a room the size of a small kitchen to sleep in, sometimes racked up 6 high in banks. This of course, results in these wonderful gadgets, that people buy in this country. But what was rather stunning, that when a reporter went to that factory, the workers had never seen an iPad completed. All they were working on were pieces of it. They'd never felt an iPad in their hand. And so upping expectation level is the first step to justice. That creates your own standards, your own yardsticks. If you allow corporations to determine what your yardsticks are by which we measure progress, we will lose the debate, we will lose the future. I remember watching Chairman Greenspan go up for his annual State of the Economy speech in Congress for the Joint Economic Commission. And he would invariably start this way: Mr. Chairman and members of the Joint Economic Committee, I'm here to state that the state of the economy is sound. Sound? By what standards? Did he say that it was sound by child poverty standards? Did he say it was sound by 1 out of every 3 full-time workers in this country making Walmart wages? At the time, $6.50, $7, $8, $9 before deductions? Was it sound by 50 million Americans who don't have health insurance? Many of them get sick, injured, and die as a result because they can't afford health insurance to get diagnosed and treated. Was it sound by all those hollowed-out communities whose factories have been shipped to repressive fascist and communist regimes overseas? Was it sound by the amount of allocation of our scientists and engineers to a massive military war machine when we don't have the Soviet Union anymore? What do we have? Half of our discretionary budget going to the military? Who's the enemy? A criminal gang that had no second strike capability? We have no more Soviet Union. Why are we building another $15 billion aircraft carrier? We have now 11. We'll have 12. The next country that challenges us is Italy. They have 2. China hasn't even built one anymore. Was it sound by more and more students unable to afford college because of tuition increases? No. It was sound because he had the indicators, the economic indicators of the business class. And so he was saying it's sound because corporate profits are up. He was saying it was sound because inventory levels are in an adequate position. It was sound because we have a lot of capital. But for what? Not as if people matter. Now, we should once in a while stop beating our breasts and saying that we're number one, we're number one. I grew up in America where all I heard was my teachers telling us we're number one. Well, we're not number one. We're not number one in wages. We're about 15 in wages. We're not number one in the low level of infant mortality. We're about 20. 19 nations have a lower infant mortality. We're not number one in a lot of things anymore. We are number one in the number of people in jail per capita, by far. We are number one in the number of people we throw into solitary confinement, a cruel and unusual punishment, if one ever saw one. But we are dramatically heading toward the kind of country that we once described Brazil as, that we once described Mexico as. That is, an oligarchy and a plutocracy, where the big, fat, wealthy families and corporations control the government. And so it's very important to ask why Western European countries, right after World War II, completely devastated. The cities were burning with smoke. The countryside was destitute. There was hunger, starvation, unemployment. And yet they got themselves together with a little help from us, the Marshall Plan. And through their unions, through their multi-party system, through their large cooperatives and small cooperatives, they demanded and received for all the people. This is over 50 years ago. They demanded and received for all the people what we, to this day, do not have for all our people. And we're the victors, and we're the richest country in the world. They demanded and received universal health care, paid maternity leave and daycare. They truly didn't want to leave any child behind. They had paid family sick leave 4 weeks or more paid vacation. It's 7 weeks now in Sweden. Inexpensive and frequent public transit. Decently kept up parks, support for the arts, stronger labor laws, free university education, and they essentially abolished poverty as we know it in this country. To this day, we do not have that. It's just not our politics failing us. It's that we have surrendered too much of our power, generically, to our representatives in Washington and state legislatures. And we have surrendered too much of our own wealth that we own to the corporations that dominate us. And until we begin thinking about how to build democracy, your dreams, with few exceptions, are going to be severely transformed into nightmares. You're entitled to ask our generation, why are we making you pay for those criminal, undeclared wars of aggression in Iraq and Afghanistan? This is the first time in American history that a president plunged us into those wars without raising taxes to pay for it, and indeed he reduced taxes on the wealthy in 2002, creating a huge segment of today's deficit. This is a presidency, and it doesn't include just Bush now, it includes Obama, who basically have announced the rules of empire. They're willing to track and kill anybody they suspect of being associated with terrorism, which they define, and they can do it by long distance from Virginia and Nevada. This is a generation that has basically said, you're going to pay for it. Because we are paying for these wars by deficit financing. And you're going to end up paying for it. There are a lot of questions you're entitled to ask us. And the more you ask us, the more you provoke our dominating conscience, and the more you inherit a conscience that you contribute to that will make you proud to pass this country on to future generations. I want to start out not with the description of corporatization. I want to start out what you as a college and students can do that nobody can stop you from doing. Whenever you start making excuses for yourself about how you're being blocked from making proper change in this country of ours, ask yourself, what are the things you can do that really nobody can stop you from doing? For starters, get you to second base. Some of these 8 points I'm going to go through quickly that you can do, you need the cooperation of your president and your college and teachers. But they're not that extravagant. By the way, one of your students graduated in 2000. His name is Jason Kafuri, and he turned out to be a spectacular organizer for us in our campaigns, including with 3 or 4 others filling Madison Square Garden in 2000 on 10 days' notice. I asked him what professors he remembers fondly, and he says, the ones I carry with me are Professor Landau, is it? Landau, and Professor Hendrickson. And so, all right, let's run down. You have political science or government courses. You can have an extraordinary influence over your members of Congress by routinely assembling voting records, attendance, and statements made by your congressman and your 2 senators, and diffuse it both physically and over the internet to everybody in Colorado. If you do this in a course that you might popularly call Congress 101, you will study Congress as it is now operating or not operating, and you will inform tens of thousands of your fellow citizens year after year. And in so doing, you become a power center in the minds of your 2 senators and representatives. I can assure you they will be talking a great deal about a course that monitors them and studies what they are doing for the people who they're supposed to represent back home. Congress 101 in 500-600 universities and colleges can begin to distinctly transform the way Congress operates. It's not very hard, is it? It's rigorous, intellectually rigorous, meets a lot of the criteria of academic achievement. Let's move to your physics and chemistry and biology labs. Suppose your chemistry lab tested drinking water for heavy metals like cadmium, mercury, lead, arsenic, and received tests from around your community in your state and routinely distributed the results of these tests. I think you would have a considerable impact in the way the Safe Drinking Act of 1974 would be enforced. You would understand what that act and what the rights it gives you are part of that law, which we worked on intensively. Let's say your biology lab tests food residues for things that shouldn't be in the food, imported food, domestic food, fungicides, pesticides, various kinds of chemicals that are there in order to make the food look presentable on the shelf, but doesn't do your own nutritional needs much good. Again, that's putting the biology lab into practical science. Let's imagine testing your own hair, or taking hair follicles and testing. Increasingly now people are saying we have labs, and we can have citizen labs, and testing hair can tell you a great deal now about the environment around you. And you have the internet to diffuse your findings. You don't have to just rely on a press conference to do so. Let's take, if you have a course called Civic Skills in Practice, I know that your college is moving in that direction, where you can actually major, not just in policy, but in civic engagement and practice as a major. How do you actually get things done when you go out in the public arena? Our country's been stalled for years now, and the people know it. The people know it like never before. It wasn't long ago that 3 polls came to my attention, and things have gotten worse for the people. 81% of the people polled thought America was going in the wrong direction. 75% of the people polled thought corporations had too much control over their lives. We're not talking about small business here. Big business, multinational. 61% of the people thought both major parties were failing. And this was before the Wall Street crash. You can imagine what it would be like. Now what that tells you is that there's a large consensus that you do not see evidenced in today's contemporary presidential debates. There is a large consensus. We tend to launch presidential candidates in the most unrepresented states in the country. We launched them first in the Iowa caucus, 99% white, 56% evangelicals. Then we go to New Hampshire, where we launch it and with a very unrepresentative state, a very nice state, I happen to like it, town meeting state, but it is not a representative state. And it has a tradition of personal campaigning and personal town meetings, which is good. And then you go to South Carolina, which a few days ago chose Gingrich, 65% evangelicals who voted. One would think they'd be consistent in their human values, but it's a free country. And it was a slice of the Republican Party that was to the right of the Republican Party that made up the electorate. Now, what would you think of Canada if they had a system where they started choosing their prime ministers in the Yukon and then Northwest Territory and ended up in Labrador? So this is why what you're hearing today is not being discussed so much. You'll never hear about the frozen minimum wage, which is now $2.75 75 cents less than it was in 1968 adjusted for inflation, even though productivity per worker has almost doubled adjusted for inflation. We're going backwards into the future, and people know it. And yet they're not getting what they know and their grievances processed through the political system, which is like a narrow crevice marinated in corporate money and filtered by a media that doesn't know how to ask a tough question about a politician. David Gregory of Meet the Press had Harry Reid on Sunday, 8 days ago. Now the first question anyone would ask Harry Reid is, he's being destroyed by the filibuster rule, and he hasn't moved when he's controlled the Senate in January 2009 and the last two rounds. He hasn't moved by majority vote to get rid of the filibuster rule, which parliamentarians say you can do. Never asked. Here's Harry Reid, who told me he believed in an up-to-date minimum wage when I interviewed him in his office a few years ago, and he was never asked about the minimum wage. Millions of people slaving away, trying to support a family on $7.50, $8, $9 an hour before deductions. So, if you had a civics course with civic skills, and if someone started this course this way, can you write a 1,000-word essay on your social skills, your athletic skills, and your academic skills? And you probably can. But suppose your teacher asked you in the first class to write a 1,000-word essay on your civic skills. Could you do it? You might want to say to the teacher, what are civic skills? Other than voting in an informed way. What should be a great civic skill? I've often said, if voters in this country would be as knowledgeable as they are about sports as about politicians, they would be extremely determined to change in this country. I mean, the strategic precision of people calling up on these sports programs about strategy, history, the sport, the coaches, who did this, who did that. I mean, it's very impressive. But they don't spend very much time studying the records of the politicians they're asked to vote for. What would you learn in civics? You'd learn how to use the Free Information Act. How many students here know how to use the Free Information Act of Colorado and the U.S. government? Okay. How many students here have never been to a McDonald's? How many have never been to Walmart? How many have never been to Starbucks? Wow. You see the saturation? You want to buy things. It's fine. You go into the commercial arena. Now let's ask 3 quick questions about the public arena. How many students have never been to a town council or a city council meeting? I see the hands. Don't be bashful. How many students here have never been to a court of law as a spectator? I see the hands. How many students here have never even been to a small claims court? I see. Okay, how many people have never been to a prison as a visitor? And how many students here spend more time looking at themselves in the mirror than watching Congress? Okay? Now, let me tell you why you should spend more time watching Congress than looking in the mirror. If someone knocked on your door and said, "Hi, I'm your new neighbor, just want to let you know, I can raise your taxes, send your children off to wars, I can let others expose you to all kinds of abuses in the marketplace and the pollution in the environment, and I just want you to know I'm your new neighbor, see you later." I mean, what would you say? Why you disturbing my text messaging? Updating my profile on Facebook? How dare you? Well, that's your member of Congress. They spend 22% of your income, at least, They really are not doing their job. They're dysfunctional. There's some good people there, but most of them are willing to gridlock and collect their emoluments. They have not used the authority that's exclusive to them under the Constitution to declare war, to initiate appropriations, to oversee the executive branch. Basically, they're severely and systemically derelict. And they're going to affect you every way, and they are affecting you every way. When they don't have strong budgets for law enforcement to recall contaminated food or hazardous medicines or to curb the violence of pollutants that are getting into your blood, it affects you. When they give incentives for corporations to abandon whole industries and ship them abroad to these countries and you can't get jobs, it affects you. When they don't regulate Wall Street and you find your parents' pensions are depleted suddenly, that they worked and hoped they would have, it affects you. There isn't anything Congress doesn't do or do that doesn't affect you. And yet, you have given them your power. And your parents have given them your power. That's what a representative republic is. And why are you giving them this kind of power without holding the reins on it, without spending more time on it? If you could only see how a very few number of people in every congressional district organized could transform Congress if they were representing agendas silently or passively supported by other people. The fourth thing you can do is you can debate the students at the Air Force Academy. Why don't you do that? Maybe you do? Okay, if you do, I've got some nice topics for you. President Bush and President Obama, war crimes or lawful wars? We actually had that debate in Washington. You can pull it down on C-SPAN. Debate them on when they will disobey their commanders, because their commanders are giving them orders that would violate the Nuremberg principles, which we have accepted in this country, part of military law and justice. Debate them on why, with no major enemies, although we're desperately searching for them, trying to make China into a military monster so we can justify an $800 billion military budget, ask them, when do they think enough is enough for a military budget? You can tell them that the former head of the U.S. Air Force, General McPeak, not long ago said, if we cannot defend America on $300 billion a year, we ought to get a new set of generals. You can cite them Smedley Butler, the double winner of the Congressional Medal of Honor in the first 4 decades of the 20th century, Marine General, who wrote the book, War is a Racket, and I Was a Racketeer for Wall Street. I made Central America safe for United Fruit. I made Cuba safe for the National Bank. I made China safe for the oil companies. Smedley Butler. Open it up. You can start a documentary film club where you actually meet face to face, not virtual reality. We live in a period of the golden age of documentary films. We live in a period in the golden age of muckraking expose books. And we live in a period when they have less and less effect in terms of change. But it's good to get some fire in your belly by sitting and watching some of these brilliantly done documentaries. You can bring the student government alive to spawn participation in college governance. You should have some role, not the major role. I understand you're going to be afforded a student trustee on the Board of Trustees with your new president. I understand that you may be asking the Board of Trustees to meet with you once a year and see what's going on and how you can contribute and learn some processes of governance. Our country is full of problems we don't deserve, full of solutions we don't apply. You take any major problem in this country, say a secular problem, hunger, pollution, waste, corruption, unfair tax systems. The work has been done on how to remedy it and how to replace it. What hasn't been done is the civic energy and the strategies to turn it around. your senior thesis. Write a senior thesis on a subject that will carry with you after graduation. My third-year thesis at law school was on unsafe automobiles, and it opened a pathway for me. You can do the same. You're never going to run out of problems or injustices. Become more active in statewide student groups or non-student groups as part of your experience on campus, like Colorado PIRG, which is not one of the larger PIRGs, but they have a very nice history of fighting for justice here in Colorado, which has not always been a very hospitable situation. Now, I put this before my other remarks because I want to make sure you're not overwhelmed by what I'm about to say. The large corporatization of America has never been worse in our history. The brilliant strategies of concentrated power by these corporations and their corporate law firms, the power brokers who almost get no attention, is truly impressive, apart from its invidious nature. Truly impressive. And let me have you test yourself. When I say that we all grow up corporate, we don't grow up civic. If we grew up civic, we would grow up participating in local government, participating in initiatives and referendums, participating in courts and judiciary, participating in neighborhood organizations. We would, in effect, spend some of our time in a deliberative democracy at whatever level we choose to spend. Half the people don't even vote in presidential elections. 2/3 almost don't vote in most congressional elections. Our forebears fought and died for the right to vote. Why don't people vote? That's a complex answer. Part of it is they don't think it means anything to them. Part of it is that it's often obstructed. We obstruct voters and candidates more than any other Western country from exercising their constitutional rights. That's what a two-party tyranny does. But growing up corporate, it's easy to figure out what happens when you grow up corporate. Growing up corporate is growing up in a society where the pressure is on to make everything for sale. Government is for sale. Elections are for sale. Politics are for sale. Commercializing childhood are for sale. Education is for sale. More and more, corporations want everything for sale because they've got money to make the buy, because they want the markets, because they want to break through their boundaries that were established over 2,000 years ago in every major religion that warned its adherents, do not give too much power to the mercantile class, because they are so singularly motivated on money and profit, so singularly directed, that they'll run roughshod over much more fundamental values in a society, whether it's tolerance, freedom, justice, you name it, as it rolls through history. Here's the way you can test yourself. I'm going to say a few words. What comes to mind? I'm going to say the following: crime, violence, regulation, welfare. Now, if what comes to mind is street crime, burglaries, rapes, wars, violence, what comes to mind in regulation is government. What comes to mind in welfare, people standing waiting for their welfare checks. Something like that. And it's not inaccurate. It's only quantitatively minute compared to corporate crime, corporate violence, corporate regulation, and corporate welfare. Corporatization means that the very style of violence and what we pay attention to in preventable violence is controlled. They want to take out of the political arena and the legal arena the casualty toll that they are responsible for causing. Terror from abroad has become a massive industry. It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. Regardless of its quantifiable risk estimate. We didn't react this way when the Soviet Union could have wiped us out in 25 minutes. We didn't freak out. We didn't curtail our civil liberties. We didn't pass a Patriot Act. We didn't arrest thousands of people without charges and throw them in jail without lawyers. When the Soviet Union had missiles that were 20 minutes away from destroying our country, and we had missiles in return. What's happening to us? The industry of terrorism wildly exaggerates the risks and curtails our freedoms. And Ron Paul is very right to point that out as he goes through the crazed Republican Party that he's a part of. Corporate welfare. Take the welfare to poor people. It cannot stack up to the welfare that we gave for the Wall Street bailout and other routine handouts to corporations. Handouts, subsidies, giveaways. We give them trillions of dollars of free research and development that have built every major new industry in our country. Aerospace, semiconductor, biotech, pharmaceutical, containerization, you name it. It wouldn't exist in today's fashion without your parents' tax dollars. Corporate welfare is massive. It's over half of what Washington does. We give away our public lands for bargain basement prices, if not free. We're the only country in the world that gives away tens of billions of dollars of hard rock metals like gold, lead, silver, molybdenum, free to corporations who discover it on our land, public lands. Corporate regulation. How do corporate regulation regulate our lives? By regulating the government to regulate our lives. There isn't a single department agency in Washington to whom you ask the question, who's the most powerful force outside and inside the department? It's corporate lobbyists and corporate appointees. Whether it's Treasury, Department of Interior, Department of Defense, you name it. That's the corporate state. And they make sure they deliver. Have you ever challenged a fine print contract when you signed your telephone contract? When you clicked on? Have you ever challenged a credit card agreement? Auto insurance policy? You can't. They don't compete. They have the same fine print. And it's all to the advantage of the sellers, not you. They even get you out of the court. They make you sign on to binding arbitration, which no government can require you as a price of not going to court. The government can't keep you from going to court, but corporations do routinely. Because they say, well, you signed it. It's on page 6, paragraph 22A1, where you say, well, I didn't have a choice. MasterCard and Visa, they have the same contract. Ford and General Motors, State Farm and Allstate, they don't compete. It's all the same fine print. It's contract servitude. It's contract peonage. Growing up corporate, you don't even think about it. You just sign on the dotted line. Don't even give it a choice, an arch diagram. The two pillars of our democracy are tort law and contract law. Tort law deals with personal injury, that if you're wrongfully injured, you have a remedy against the perpetrator of your harms, whether it's a defective car or untested drug or whatever. And contract, we've lost the freedom of contract to these fine print, non-competitive corporate Goliaths. Talk about regulation. You're heading for the hospital on the stretcher, you sign a waiver. You waive your right in case they have negligence, if it isn't in your insurance contract. This is what we call contract servitude, contract peonage. Corporate crime compared to street crime. Street crime criminals dream of the wealth of corporate criminals. There's no comparison. You want to look up the Corporate Crime Reporter.org or .com? It's a weekly. The editor told me he could do it daily. There's so much corporate crime. And it's reported. A lot of it's openly reported. So ask yourself, what is it when we hear the words crime, violence, regulation, and welfare, we don't relate to the giant corporations and what they are doing and not doing? Ask yourself, who defines human beauty? It's defined by the fashion and cosmetic industry. And we internalize it in our relations with one another. And it's totally skin deep and body shape. It isn't beauty in terms of any character, any personality. It isn't beauty in terms of being witty or friendly or brave. People would say Mother Teresa was a beautiful person. They weren't talking about the cosmetic definition. And yet we internalize it, and it's big business. It's over $100 billion. And we don't even question it. And it can be very cruel. There are a lot of teenagers who are on the verge of slashing their wrists because they think they're ugly. Skin deep, body shape. What do you say when you say, someone asks you, are you free? How many people think they're free? Let me see the hands. Well, how do you define freedom? Yes, I agree. We are free, personally. We are free to buy what we want, listen to what music we want, choose our friends, date who we want, marry who we want, divorce who we want, travel who we want. We're free to get into a 5,000-pound SUV and go 3 blocks to a store to buy chiclets if we want. That's not civic freedom. There are a lot of dictatorships that allow you to do that. It's not civic freedom. Civic freedom is having a role about how the student loan companies for decades until the reforms kicked in were ripping off students like crazy. And if you were broke and went bankrupt, the taxpayer made up the difference for Sally Mae and the banks. And the students had no role. Civic freedom is having a role as voters to break up the two-party restriction on voter choice and open up the gates to third parties and different agendas. Civic freedom is changing this malicious tax system where you have dozens of very profitable companies paying no taxes, no income. General Electric, Verizon, Honeywell. Check out Citizens for Tax Justice, the most accurate compiler of tax rates in the country. Citizensfortaxjustice.org. That's civic freedom. Cicero once defined freedom better than anything I've ever seen. He said freedom is participation in power. By that definition, how much power do we have? But the oligarchs and the plutocrats, they want to focus you on your freedom to buy an iPad. Your freedom to buy a Tootsie Roll. Your freedom to have 15 different kinds of cereals and 20 different kinds of soft drinks. We got to be smarter than that. There's too much at stake. At the same time that we have great solutions coming on board, social solutions, cooperatives, ways to develop neighborhood daycare centers. We have solutions for the tax laws as a nation. We certainly have a lot of technological solutions. We should have had solar energy decades ago, energy efficiency decades ago, but that wasn't profitable for the coal, oil, gas, and uranium companies. They make profit from energy waste. The more your vehicle wastes energy, the more gasoline ExxonMobil sells. It's a perverse incentive that's been operating for years. And yet, we've allowed them to do that. Ask yourself, well, what kind of assets do we have? I mean, we're powerless. You just finished telling us how powerless we are. What kind of assets we have? Try the vote, properly targeted and properly withheld. Try organizing 2,000 people in every congressional district, giving $100, raising or giving $100 and 100 hours a year, with 2 offices in each congressional district and 4 full-time people, forwarding an agenda for long overdue changes in this country, affecting workers, patients, consumers, small taxpayers, neighborhoods, communities, pensions, environment. Try that. That's 1 million people. 2,000 in each congressional district. You wouldn't recognize how fast Congress would change. When we went to Washington, the arch Spokesman for big business was Senator Warren Magnuson from Washington State. He was chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee. We had a whole agenda of consumer protection legislation, flammable fabrics to protect children, prevention, auto safety, on and on. We said, forget it, Magnuson, Maggie. He doesn't even know how to spell consumer. In 5 years, Warren Magnuson became the greatest champion of consumer legislation in American legislative history. Because he had his finger to the wind, and he heard the rumble of the people back in Seattle and Tacoma and Salem from the 60s. Richard Nixon signed into law legislation he hated with great introduction to each law. He signed OSHA into law, EPA into law. He signed the Product Safety Commission into law. He wanted to give voting rights to the District of Columbia for Congress, which they still don't have. He wanted a rehabilitation policy for drugs instead of an incarceration policy. He had a minimum incomes plan to reduce poverty. He couldn't get some of the latter through. Why did he sign on to all these? Because he was afraid of the rumble of the people. He was afraid of the demonstrations, the marches. Now, we all will do in life a lot more difficult things than to become active, engaged citizens. It's not that hard. It's just a new routine. It's a new culture. All of you will do in life far more difficult things. You will raise children. Try that one for more difficult things. You may have a sick child or a sick parent or a sick grandparent. You may be a single mom. You may have to deal with a catastrophe, like an earthquake. You may have to deal with a disabling accident for your loved ones. Some of you may have to have trouble just making ends meet. Civic engagement is modest compared to this. And it will prevent a lot of the serious problems that I just mentioned as a result. So keep asking yourself questions that you ordinarily don't ask yourself. Who in American history kept saying no to the progress that we now take for granted? Industry said no to the abolition of slavery, the cotton industry. The modern factory said no to women's right to vote because the women were fighting for consumer protection and for the abolition of child labor. The banks and railroads fought against the farmers and the worker fair labor standards. Again and again, it's the corporations subordinating civic and humane values to the triumph of commercial values, which is a great struggle in history, going back thousands of years. Who, for example, who would identify an institutional insanity phenomenon? Have you ever discussed institutional insanity? Can you imagine GM refusing to be toilet trained for 60 years from its pollution? Can you imagine a country that has no major enemy spending half its budget on the military, contractors, etc.? Would a family spend half its budget for a non-existent enemy of any proportion in its community? It would be considered parental neglect of the children. Institutional insanity is something that should be discussed. We discuss too much individual mental health problems. We should talk about the mental health of the NCAA. How about the mental health of the drug companies who basically say pay or die, even though they're subsidized to the hilt by free taxpayer-funded research and development, tax credits, and other assistance from the public. Let me just conclude by this question. Why is it so difficult to diffuse good business practices? Interface Corporation is on the way to 100% recycling and zero pollution. Its CEO just passed away from cancer, Ray Anderson, a great man. In 1994, he attended a lecture on the ecology of industry by Paul Hawken, came back to his tile carpet manufacturing company, which is now the biggest in the U.S., with 5 plants abroad. And he told his staff, we are going to convert the technology in this company so that by the year 2015, zero pollution, 100% recycling, reducing our expenses, increasing our profits, and making this a great place to work. And they're on schedule. Why isn't that in the headlines? Why don't more people know about the industrial practices of Patagonia? Why is that in the headlines? That's something for all of us to ponder. It goes right to the core that we cannot have a democracy without our own democratic media, with our non-commercial media. I'll leave you with the cover story of today's Time magazine. It's on Warren Buffett, and it's what he believes in. And he's the richest man in America. And he thinks he and others are undertaxed. He thinks that estate tax should be preserved. He thinks a lot of things that are anathema to the Chamber of Commerce crowd. Read the interview and ask yourself, if he wasn't super rich, why wouldn't his value system of how businesses should be run and how much they should contribute to the common welfare through taxation, it wouldn't be news. And the same is true for a number of other mega billionaires who are not getting the press they deserve, even though they're enlightened, older age, 70s, 80s, 90s, and their credibility would be spectacular. But it's not getting that kind of publicity. I leave you with all the things that you can do here at Colorado College to get your civic career underway. It'll be a wonderful way to go through life. There's no worse way than going through life feeling powerless. You can't fight City Hall or you can't fight Exxon. Overall, there's a bright future only if we take the reins. And the Occupy movement in its next stage, called American Spring, and the huge organized presence in Washington in late March, spanning a number of days, gives you an entry level to see what you're made of and to see whether you're going to be able to answer the question, in addition to how's your social life, how's your civic life? Because without a civic life, we have a democracy in name and an oligarchy and plutocracy in reality. I want you to connect with your own student groups and the one that I helped start, the PIRGs, uspirg.org, uspirg.org, and ask yourself, how much did students give up to have a national lobby heavily on consumer, finance, and environment that has 80 full-time people, funded by students and door-to-door canvassing? See how little it takes. And it's a power to be reckoned with. Go through life saying to yourself, am I exaggerating what it's going to take for the American people to turn their country around? Or I'm going to face reality, stop making excuses, and get the critical mass of public energy underway as I and my generation can. So that when we look at our children and grandchildren, we will not pass a country and a world onto them in a condition for which they will curse us. If that isn't enough of a motivation, I leave you with the bright lights of past American history, where the profiles of courage brought us what we like about our country today. Thank you.